Welcome to Your Hired Radio. I'm your host, Lorne Epstein. You're listening to 96.7 FM. Welcome to the show. Today we are going to talk about making meaning at work. And that's not like working at a meaning-making factory. That's how do we enjoy our work and give it a sense of depth beyond the fact that we're earning an income. With me today, I have Paul Costello, and he's an old friend, but he's an incredible philosopher around life and story and narrative and how things get put together in the world. Paul is the president and founder of New Story Leadership. He's been a lifelong educator, writer, and recognized world expert in the area of narrative practice. In addition, Paul works as the founding director of the Center for Narrative Studies. He's designed trainings and leadership programs that use the power of story for transformative change. Most notably in peace programs, including the Washington-Ireland Program, South African International Program, and New Story Leadership for the Middle East. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lorne. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited. I've wanted to have you on my show forever. I think since before I had the show.
We usually have some great conversations. It's usually not taped, but this is great.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about people work, right? And they make a thing or they do a thing, but that's so unsatisfying, I think, for most of us. What do you see now as far as people being able to take their work and give it some substance? Giving it, substance isn't the right word, but meaning, right? And what do we mean by meaning?
The way I look at it, I mean, I'm currently director of a local AmeriCorps program, which is a state and federal funded thing, and with my young people working with disadvantaged kids in schools, because it's public funding, you're always being asked to measure the impact. What was the intervention, what were the outputs, and so on like that, and the outcomes. But the narrative way of looking at it is, I'm always coming at it to say, what stories are we creating? So that you just think no matter what we're doing in our work life, we're going home to our wife and our kids and we're telling them what we did today at work. Or our kids are saying to their friends at school, what does your daddy do? What does your mummy do? That somehow or other, I'm always interested in how the work experience translates into stories. Because to me, when people are telling stories, they're making meaning and they're giving value to something. So that's where my ears pick up to say, what's the story here? Which means what's the deeper meaning? Because when we're creating meaning, we're creating value. And that's somehow tied up with the way stories work.
So I go to work and something happens at work. I go home and I tell my wife and my family, this is what happened at work. That's the story. And that's the experience other people have of my work. So if I have a good day or a bad day, that's what's kind of going down the line.
Right. But I mean, in terms of factoring this into, say, you're making cars. What are the stories? It's the old marketing thing, isn't it? What are the stories that people are telling about your car? Do the airbags explode or not? Now, we've seen, do you fly United Airlines? Great. They've got a major airline. They're mostly pretty good. But then get one video showing them dragging a passenger off the plane against his will. What happens? Their stock exchange value nosedives. They're putting huge one-page ads in the New York Times and the Washington Post apologizing. I mean, I flew at a United Airline about a week afterwards, and it was like being a celebrity. They couldn't do enough to make people feel, because you see, or even like Volkswagen or some of these car companies, they sell millions and millions and millions of cars, and most of the time they're great. But just get 8 or 10 or 12, 0.002% of the production line has some problems with the brakes or has some problem with, ignition or something. That's the story that becomes the story of the work, of what the value is. So I just think, in my work and in the work with my peers, there's now a lot of popularity around getting leaders to tell stories. How can you be a leader, and how can you tell stories for business and stories for marketing? And I think that's all very well, but I'm much more focused on what's the story your organization or your work is creating? What's the story people are telling about you, not the story you're telling?
Well, when you say the story that your organization is creating, you mean the folks who work at the company are telling stories. All sorts of stories. That's the story you're talking about.
Well, I think that's one set of stories.
Because it could be an amalgam.
I think it's a subset of stories. It's like you sell your product and people get the product. They're telling stories to their neighbors about whether that heating system was worth the money or not. The people working inside the factories making the heating systems are telling stories about how their bosses are treating them, whether they get respect or not. So, there's layers and layers and layers, which builds up the sort of the reputational capital, so to speak, of your workplace. So, I work with a lot of millennials, and what I find with them is, they want good money, but the trade-off is good money and a meaningful work. They want both. They just don't want the good money. They want to know that they're making a contribution, that it means something, that it has some larger significance than just going and pushing a button and taking a paycheck home.
It's funny. I'm a X-Gen, and my generation is kind of like the dip, right?
Right.
We were the bottom of the curve. We had no say in what was going on. No. I feel so jealous of the millennials who, like, they want something, they get it. Like, that all sounds so great to me. I'd love to have, like, meaning and work and money and all those things. Meaning at work, excuse me.
If they can. You see, I'll give you an example. Yesterday, one of my members who's just finishing up, we'd say we'll just call her Mary. She's moving from America and she's been offered a job at a really good NGO, out of town.
NGO means non-governmental.
A non-profit.
Non-profit.
Yeah, it's sort of working with kids, the stuff that she loves to do. And they really want her. And it's the sort of work she just, gets up in the morning to do. But she's got she's got student debt, and she's got, a sick mother that she's got to sort of support and other family obligations. They're not going to pay her enough money. So I get an email from her just the other day saying, Paul, can you give me some advice? I really love this job. It's very meaningful. It's exactly what I want. But I'm going to be in Struggle Town for the next 3 or 4 years. They're not going to pay me enough money. What do I do? So I think, some of the millennials have it all, but some of them, because they want meaning, especially in the non-profit world, sometimes it's disturbing because I think goodwill gets exploited and the non-profits aren't paying enough. But people are doing it because they believe in the cause. And
right.
that's the dilemma.
Do you know Dan Pallotta?
No.
So Dan set up the, have you heard of the AIDS rides?
Yeah.
So that was Dan's thing back in the late 90s and through the 2000s. Anyway, his main point now is that we don't treat nonprofits fairly. Right. That we should put more money into advertising. Like, nonprofits should become excellent. They should become the Mercedes-Benzes and the Apples.
I couldn't agree more.
And the people that work there should get paid high salaries, and that their results would be amazing instead of being so meager. And we'd attract the better talent for those nonprofits instead of, some of the better talent going to Apple and IBM. They would go to these nonprofits. And I think you're right. It's kind of weird that we want to do good, but we kind of struggle. We kind of suffocate the do-gooders a bit. And that's part of the meaning, right?
Well, I think...
I think a lot of people try to make meaning of their commercial jobs, but there's not always significant meaning there.
Well, I think it's part of the structure of, the capitalism in terms of the market value of what you do. And if you're selling a commodity that's rare, then you can make a lot of money. But in terms of the meaning, some very meaningful, not to say that other jobs aren't, but, you think of the teachers, or a special education teacher, or a nurse, or a nurse's aide. Now, I think the doctors and the pharmacists have it pretty good because they're in a pretty high income bracket. But, you go to hospital and you're admitted for some test, and, you've got someone coming in who's taking your blood pressure and making sure you're okay. Their income level isn't necessarily, commensurate with the value that they're providing for you. So I think that's what... I'm interested in this. To me, it seems like there's some shift going on, or some conversation going on with the recent election, with, say, what Bernie Sanders is saying, and raising this whole issue about the disparity between the rich and the poor, or the whole class structure. Are the people who are really given value to a community getting rewarded in a way that's parallel to some people who are just making lots and lots of money because they're just pushing buttons, trading stocks, or pig hog dividends or hog, like you're just gambling, and they're making a lot of money. But I mean, what meaning are they contributing to the world? And it's not to be judgmental of them, but I just think it's the system. There's something about the system, and there's something that people are looking for more meaning. That's the dividend. I mean, I was thinking like profit has come to me. When I say what's the profit, people think that just means it's a spreadsheet. It's two numbers. But the real word profit comes from the advantage or the extra. What are you taking? What's the more in this? And I'm interested to see what the current conversation is. The more isn't just necessarily an extra $10 in your pay packet.
Right. It's the difference. And when you say meaning, I mean, I always think of what's the impact that what I do makes on someone else's life.
Right.
Right. So I know here on our show a year ago, this is our year anniversary.
Wow. Congratulations.
Thanks. We did a show on military transitions, and we, by the way, we do this show for no money. No one pays me to do this. Right. We actually pay fees. But one of the folks who lives in my neighborhood had just separated from the military, and he'd come home that summer. He's like, I'm leaving the military. I need a job. So I did a show on military transitions. He got a job right out of that show.
Wow.
And that's, one of the prouder things I am of this show is like, hey, what we did actually helped his family provide for his family. And then we did a follow-up this year with him and another person who was transitioning out, and now he was going on to his second job.
Right.
So to me, that's the meaning of what I do, is that I tell my crew, I tell Afotey and I tell Alex, this isn't about making radio. This is about helping people in their lives with their jobs. Somebody's listening to the show right now going, what is Paul and Lorne talking about? I have no freaking clue. It's okay. We don't have a clue either. Right. But we're still going to try and make a difference, whether you like it or not.
Right. Right.
Hopefully you like it.
But I think you're the perfect example. And I think in a way, I don't know, I've been reading a book by, I'm trying to think of his name. He's a senator. He's just a new senator in Congress.
Oh, Al Franken.
No. He's new. He's a former, he's a former college president. Sam, I'm trying to think of his second name. No. But he's making the point that, that the American dream, as perceived, say, 100 years ago, was about the community spirit and the local spirit, and that it functioned not because big government was spending a lot of money. It functioned because the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides and the school boards and the Rotary Club and the churches and the synagogues all took some sort of local responsibility, and they knew that if they took out of a community, they had to give back to a community. And that kind of knit the community together. I think the world is kind of, through the media and through sort of, I guess a lot of it's to the economics of things that somehow fragments a lot of that. And I think people are searching to recover it. I think they're searching to find meaning at their front door. They're finding meaning maybe watching some TV show. But I mean, in the end, their family, their kids, their school, their parents, and doing a job that matters. Doing something that's important, something worth getting up for.
I'll tell you a funny story. There's a large multi-billion-dollar company that is going to be on our radio show. And I was talking to the vice president, and they are doing a program with where they're taking folks who need education. They have a skills gap problem. So this large company is doing this work for skills gap, and it's a little bit of a business, a tiny, small bit of their business. But he talks to the CEO about it. And the CEO is so excited about this, more excited about this than the parts of their business that make all the money. And I thought, that's exactly what...
Right.
Of course.
Right.
It's exciting because people feel good about doing good.
Right.
People always feel good about doing good. And we know what that means. Right. When I know that my life's been lived and yours is a little bit better, and maybe that's not true for all people. Some people may not have that level of empathy or don't connect what they do as a value to other people in a more holistic way. But I think what you're saying, or at least what I'm getting from it, is that if I can create a story from what I do that is about how what we do makes a difference, that will really make a positive impact. And it could be at a Mercedes-Benz or at a big company, right? But it's to find those stories. Which is kind of what you do, right?
It's to find them and then sort of somehow if you go into an organization and you're doing some consulting as you do, and you're kind of listening and you're talking to the bosses and you're talking to the board members and then you're talking to the staff and you're talking to the customers, and then you're giving some feedback to an organization to say, this is what we're finding, that's great, and that's one way of doing it. But I'm much more now to sort of say, let's be intentional about this. Like, what story do you want? So often in
well, you're saying that I should just pluck a story out of the story?
No. I mean, part of it is. I mean, I know you do some great shows telling people what kind of interview questions to get ready for when they go for a job interview. One of the ones I love to suggest to people is, you've had other people like me working for your company. I wonder now, could you tell me a story about success? Could you say, what does success look like, say, for someone like me who's just a graduate from University of Maryland? Have you had someone like me before, and what's the success in your organization look like? So what I'm saying to people is, at the back end of doing something, to sit down, and I do this with my training, to say, what is your intention? What story, if you're starting to sell a new car, what would be a customer story that you'd hear over here on a bus, which would tell you, my car is a success. And
give us an example of that in a second when we come back from a break.
Sure.
You're listening to You're Hired on 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia. I'm your host, Lorne Epstein. Thanks for listening to our show. If you're interested in getting on the show, you can give me a call at 240-876-0276, or follow us on Facebook at You're Hired, and you can join my meetup where we teach interview skills at Interview Skills to Get the Job at meetup.com. Again, I'm your host, Lorne Epstein. You're listening to You're Hired on 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia. Welcome back to the show. You're listening to You're Hired. I'm your host, Lorne Epstein. We're talking to Paul Costello, and the subject is making meaning at work. Paul, give us an example of a story that would convey meaning at work.
Well, I mean, say, for example, maybe it's a story of a mum picking up her kids from soccer practice who gets caught in traffic and is distracted by the younger kid at the back. And she comes across an intersection and she's late going through a light that's changing. And she comes about 2 seconds away from having a full-on collision. And she knows about this car. It's supposed to be one of the safest cars, but when she slams on the brake, everything works as it's supposed to work. And she says, like, it saved my life. It saved my kids. It's like exactly what the car said it was going to do. It did. And then, in fact, I mentioned that to the dealer next time I got it serviced, and he made a big deal about that it mattered that I was in this situation, and that went back to the company to say, that's precisely what we want. So now, okay, that's playing it forward to read it back. It's like saying, get ahead of your story, get ahead of it, go out 5 years and say, imagine that we're there looking back. What are they going to be saying about you? It's almost like someone has this idea of a pre-mortem, not a post-mortem.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. If we could tell the story in the future now, what would it be?
Like, let's go to the future and go back to now and say, what's the story we want now to be part of if we're moving in a certain direction? And then I think, all right, then sit down. And I mean, I do story mapping and story design work to say, all right, there's a beginning and a middle and an end. You want that story to happen. Then it's not a haphazard process.
Let's talk about the process in a minute, but I want to talk more about this intersection of where story occurs, right? Well, where we pluck stories from,
right?
It seems like you have this vast, context of what's going on in an organization, but that the place that we look for story is maybe where what we do and human lives kind of intersect or touch.
Right. Well, it's funny you say that, Lorne, because over years of going into corporations and, wanting to what's the corporate story? What's the story that really matters? Inevitably, it's not a story about how I raised the price of that chemical and we made $1 million profit in Singapore.
Right.
That's never the story,
Or
really.
how our computer system's so much better than another computer system.
It's boring. It's kind of like, no, it was like your story, which is to say something we did made a difference to somebody else's life.
Right.
That mother says, those brake systems that you raved about, and I half believed they actually worked, they saved my life. It was worth the extra $5,000 of buying this car. You do the radio show and it's, you're subsidizing yourself, but somebody got a job through what you guys did. Wow. So there's the bonus, there's the profit, there's the value that's been added because of what you've been offering here. So, I mean, I think the personal is the political, but the personal is almost everything. That's the kind of that's the kind of insight that we get, which means then that there is. I mean, I often think they talk about the life work balance, and to me, it's like, what is that? Do you compartmentalize things like that? I don't think you. Now that the internet and the phone, how can you?
Yeah, right.
How can you do that anymore?
Right.
So if life and work are intermingling like that, then the work better be meaningful.
Right,
because
and the story should be potent.
And the story should be potent, But often, as you said, the stories are in the most unusual places. Again, when I'm going into an organization, I want to know who the story keepers are, and they may be the CEO or the board members or the founder, or it could well be the janitor. That's
funny you should say that. So my wife Alicia does work in consulting, and she was consulting for a bunch of gyms up in Boston, and they had a meeting, around culture, and the janitor, who only speaks Portuguese, been there for 20 years, right? No one really knows him. They know what he looks like, and they say hello, but nobody really knows him. He had the opportunity to get up and speak in front of the entire company.
Wow.
And it was translated, and everyone was blown away because he talked about his passion of how what he does in keeping the place clean and in order allows people to be healthy.
Right.
And they were moved. They were saying things like, wow, it was like listening to Martin Luther King.
Wow.
Like that's the kind of power and that's what you're talking about.
Right. Yeah.
So if I'm in an organization and we make widgets, not exactly useful to anybody, how would I go looking for the story?
Well, it may be that everyone else makes widgets, but it's like when you buy a chicken or you buy some food. Have the chickens been feed fed or are they roaming free? It's like it's not. We make widgets, but we make sure that the staff who make it are safe, and we have an education program for their kids, and we give opportunities to veterans and to new immigrants. So the widgets you buy is not just a widget that's just going to fit into that little machine, but buying our widget supports a bigger story of responsible employer relations, building a community, all that kinds of stuff. Now, I mean, it can be easily exploited. I think there's a lot of tokenism in this. I think a lot of corporations know that that's the feel-good thing, but they're still driven by the profit because the shareholders are saying, we need a dividend. But again, I don't know. It feels like there's some conversation going on around that's deeper than just profit and loss sheet. Has
it changed in the last couple of decades? I mean, the notion of story, like growing up, I never heard of the notion of narrative or story,
right,
other than someone tells you a story or you read a story.
Right.
But it wasn't as overt maybe in business, although maybe it was used. But it seems like it's much more in the zeitgeist.
Well, it is. I mean, almost 20 years ago now, when people from the World Bank and when we got together and I think remember you were part of it, like the Golden Fleece organization, to say a recognition that stories are resources, stories are assets.
I wasn't. Alicia was. But I was not.
Yeah. And I mean, you're running up against this sort of rational bottom line kind of, it's just a story. We want facts. We want figures. We want bottom line measures around stuff. And I mean, people like Steve Denning and Seth Khan and these people trying slowly to infiltrate the business psyche to say, hang on a second, it doesn't matter whether you've got good results. There's a story. They inevitably are going to generate a story to make meaning out of it. for anyone to believe what you're telling them. So I think now it's mainstream. Well, what's mainstream is teaching leaders how to tell stories. But I think the next step is that that can be, I mean, honestly, Stalin was a great storyteller and Hitler was a great storyteller. Just getting up and telling the story isn't necessarily a guarantee of virtue or constructive contribution to a community. I think there's a lot more other elements to it.
So what are the elements of a good story? I mean, you talked about virtue and contribution to the community.
Right.
What would I look for if I was going to make a story about this show? Right? I mean, the one about Brandon Devine getting this job.
Mm-hmm.
What would be a way for me to create a narrative? Like, what would be the process you would take someone through, or how would you think of it? Just so I think folks get understand of like the components of story and how story develops.
Well, I mean, part of it is your backstory. Why you're doing this? What's the origin story?
Right. So my backstory is kind of like where I came from, right? Like,
right. Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, so that this fits, that somehow there's an inspiration in a past story that makes this chapter coherent and fitting in. Like if this is chapter 5, what was chapter 3? So this is an unfolding. It's a bigger narrative than just suddenly popping in one day a year ago and saying, hey, I want to do a radio show. So no. When I was 12, I remember listening every Saturday night to the radio, and my favorite show was this horror story about Superman and blah, blah, blah. And then something happened. Right, you've got a backstory. So that's, I mean, see, I think people think...
I don't think I have a backstory. What's my backstory, Afotey?
Well...
Was I like... I don't know. I wasn't definitely not like, a really privileged kid, but I don't have a good backstory. I need a good backstory.
Well, you see...
That's our next project.
It is a big... But I mean, in my work, whenever someone says they haven't got a story, then my radar goes right up, because they do have a story. They just don't know it. But
I don't know it. I should say I don't know my backstory.
Yeah. But I mean, I think part of it is...
My character development is not quite there.
I mean, this whole process
Although I'm quite the character.
Exactly. Yeah, look at you smiling. You're beaming there. Yeah. No, I mean, that's one of it. One of the things. So there's a backstory about what brought you here. And then there's a forward story, which is, as I said before, go forward 5 years, and you've been doing this show for 5 years. What would be some of the stories of success that would show you that it's been worth your while? And you invent those. You create those almost as fictions, as guiding fictions.
What people don't know, before every show, I meet with Afotey and Alex. We sit around the table. We go through the day's schedule. And I ask them what context are they bringing to the day. And, they'll bring different contexts. I'm going to be the context of excellence or teamwork or, whatever it is. And we generate that. And that's part of how we keep ourselves kind of up and because we record 4 or 5 shows on a weekend.
Yeah.
For those who are listening, this isn't actually happening on a Monday.
Right.
But it's happening on a weekend. And then we at the end, we see, did we do it? We talk about that.
Right.
Did we get it done? And we have a feel for the day of how the shows went.
Right.
And I can say today has gone very well.
Right. But I mean, I love that because you're infusing into the process the value. You're making sure that your intention is clarified, and it's everyone is on the same page around, or they've got different values that they want to invest in what you're doing. And I think it shows. It bleeds out into what you're doing.
So most shows I do usually with 2 guests, sometimes 3. It's very rare that I do a show with one person. And the reason I'm doing a show with you alone, Paul, is because you're incredibly fascinating. We're talking about the story, and maybe we'll come back to it, but I want people to know what you're doing, because to me, it's like incredible work around the kids that you work with. So I want you to tell the story, particularly about the Palestinians and the Israelis. Right. So tell us that story.
Well, I mean, I'm very lucky. I get to work with amazing young people from conflict and post-conflict parts of the world. It started in Ireland and Northern Ireland about 20 years ago with a program called the Washington Island Program, which is still going strong and has about 600 alums. And then there was the South African program, which is 10 years on, and now the last 8 years we've been doing Israel and Palestine. And it's kind of based upon the insight that stories are dangerous. Stories are amazingly powerful beasts. And in a war zone, stories are like bombs. They're like hand grenades. And for wars to continue, you got to keep telling these stories over and over and over. So if you're going to plan an intervention, one way of doing it is to look at the story patterns and the story systems and create a shared experience between Catholics and Protestants, between black, white and coloured South Africans, or between Jewish kids and Arab kids from Israel and Palestine. And you set it up in Washington, and you set it up in a summer, and you make it as intense and as... but part of the deal is you're trying to create an exception to the dominant story, which is always, Arabs will always hate Israelis. Israelis will never get on with Palestine. And you're trying to create one exception just to put your foot in the door to say, it may be true, except when it's not. And at least for 7 weeks, it's not true. And then you open up a little door of possibility to say, well, maybe this could be the start of a new story. Now, Israel-Palestine is very difficult at the moment, but you get some return on investment. So 2 weeks ago, one of the young people, he was 21, came on the Irish program in 2000, actually. Yeah, 2000. A week and a half ago, he was elected the Prime Minister of Ireland.
Wow.
And he gave a speech about a week ago saying, one of the things that inspired him was being on our program. Wow. And he worked with Congress. And the thing about him is, his name is Leo Varadkar. He's 38. He's probably one of the youngest prime ministers ever in Ireland's history. His parents are from India, subcontinent India. So he's not your traditional pale-faced, white Irish kid. Well, he's not a kid, but I mean Irish person. He's Indian ethnic origin, so which is wonderful. So there's not a pure white Prime Minister of Ireland. And he's gay. He's openly gay. So I just think for Ireland, which is usually, Catholic, white, and, it's wow, that's a new story. And to feel that we were part of that. On the program, he met with, he was Catholic, he met with Protestants, he was from the South, he met with people from the North. They were part of the affiliation that he was able to maintain and keep a story, a possibility that maybe Ireland could have a new story. So I think...
So let me, the program that he and these other kids go to, it's 7 weeks, it's in the summer, and is it every day?
Yeah, they stay with host families, usually paired together. So we put an Israeli and a Palestinian. They're in their 20s. They're not kids. These are not teenagers.
Young adults.
They're young adults. 3 days a week, they're in a work placement. Some of them we put on the Hill, working with congressmen. In the good old days when President Clinton was in office, I was putting these Irish kids in the White House and in the First Lady's office and Obama's office and McCain's office and all those, because the Congress has a love affair with Ireland. And we were able to use that a bit to our advantage. Israel-Palestine, so they work with congressional offices or with non-profits like Americans for Peace Now, Mosaic Theatre, which is Ari Roth's great project down there on H Street. So 3 days a week they do a work placement exposure, and then on Mondays we do specialist training, and on Fridays they do training.
So the Fridays and Mondays, everyone comes together and trains.
Comes together, and then part of the process is, we want them to learn the American story and the power of the American story on the basis that, that story is shaping their reality in Israel and Palestine. So they better understand how Americans hear their own story. So they were all there on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on 4th of July watching the fireworks, along with the Irish kids and the South African kids. Part of that is just to be anthropologists. What's going on here? Why are Americans so proud? And sure enough, that's what's shaping the way they perceive Israel and the way they perceive Palestine in terms of policy. So starting next week at SAIS, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, next Monday morning, the day that you're hearing this broadcast, they've got a conference at SAIS where they're speaking to American academic community. On Wednesday, they speak to members of Congress. So the second part of it is to tell their own story, to educate American Washington audiences about what's really going on and what do young people in Israel and Palestine really, really want.
And I know you've got a plug we want to get in this show. Mm-hmm. You're looking for folks.
Well, I mean, I'm privileged to wear lots of hats, Lorne. I mean, I'm always...
You wear a lot of hats. It's that is an understatement.
I mean, in terms of the international programs, we're always looking for work placements and host families and funding and donations because it's all done privately. But the other hat I wear is I'm the director of an AmeriCorps program, which is funny because I'm an Australian running an AmeriCorps program in Montgomery County and South Silver Spring. So I'm in the process of recruiting. I've got about 13 slots open for full-time volunteers to be part of AmeriCorps AmeriCorps to work with K through 12 students from disadvantaged backgrounds around tutoring, learning coaches, and teachers' assistants. And it's called Project Change, AmeriCorps Project Change. It's been going for about 16 years.
And when does it start?
So, I mean, we'll sign up people in the middle of August, beginning to get ready to start 1st of September. And, they get health insurance, they get a living stipend, and they earn an education scholarship if they complete their year of service.
And there's definitely meaning in that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's transformative for these young people. I mean, it's what I love about America. I just love this whole service. I think that's part of what meaning is about in terms of the opportunity. This is like the domestic Peace Corps. You don't go overseas. You go into your local community and work with immigrants and refugees and poor kids and stuff. But it's just like you're not getting paid much. You're really having to deal with lots of issues and challenges that these kids are facing, suicide and gang violence and whatever. But I mean, my young people, the AmeriCorps volunteer team are just sensational. They're just inspirational because they draw so much meaning. They're giving so much, but they're getting so much back.
That is probably one of the great American stories is volunteerism.
Unbelievable.
There's probably not an unmet challenge in our country that doesn't have volunteers supporting the betterment of whatever's going.
Well, one of the things about story, when you're working story, is the power of the listener. So part of it is, people listening to this radio broadcast, that better than I do. But I don't know.
I think actually there's just one person listening.
But when I'm with my AmeriCorps team, I mean, I want to reflect back to them how amazing. I mean, I'm the listener who's wanting to always show them I'm amazed about and delighted and inspired by everything that they're doing. And that's really important, I think, to have a listener like that. It elicits a special kind of story.
Yeah, sure. I get that. I mean, there's definitely a value to being a great listener.
Right.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Because we were talking about telling stories, which is like that outward, the production, right? The production. But being a good consumer of stories is really valuable to the story.
I think it's critical in the current state of play of our country, given that, there's a big thing about fact checking and stories that are coming out from public places as to say, well, we're listeners, we're consumers. And I always say, it's like a packet of cigarettes. Every story should come with a warning, which says, this story may be dangerous to your health.
Right.
It's been proven that some stories cause lung cancer, and some stories cause violence, and some stories cause prejudice. So, be skeptical, be aware.
There's a story recently about, what actually happened was a guy came up to a restaurant here in D.C. thinking that there was some kind of crime going on, and he had a weapon.
Yeah.
And he was like investigating it, but he wasn't a police officer or a law enforcement officer. And no, thankfully no one got hurt. But he took some illegal action based on a story he thought it was true, which was completely untrue.
Right. And it was propagated by people who should have known better in terms of putting it out on their tweets and everything else like that. I think the listening thing is really critical around what I think is what we call a narrative literacy. Teaching people how to read stories in a sense of knowing that there's intention. Every story has an intention. And so,
and listeners pick up on that.
Well, I think they intuitively do.
Some
do. Someone just said, never trust a breathless salesman. I mean, it's like, he's trying to sell me the car and he's going to try and sell it to me in 5 minutes. But if that's coming from the Pentagon or the White House or the Department of Treasury, it's just like the old notion of being not cynical, but being skeptical, which is to say, they've got to, I'm not a pushover. You got to prove it to me. And if I suspect that there's intentions behind it, then I should be forewarned. And I just think, in some areas in our lives, we know that immediately. Our kids come home with excuses about why they didn't do their homework. We know that. But I think it's about owning our own narrative vulnerabilities. There's some stories we are just, we can be conned into them all the time.
Sure.
Sure. So that's part of the narrative literacy is know what stories that you're liable to be hooked on.
Yeah.
And, politicians know that to an absolute, nth degree. They
can
play
say
on
a few words and
on our weaknesses or our dreams or our fantasies. And,
right. Those hot button issues they talk about. They're hot buttons for a reason.
Precisely. But I mean, just to say, well, stories, I talk about Washington as the republic of stories, that really it is this interplay of stories. And, I also train DC tour guides, trying to help them.
You train DC tour guides?
Tell them, when you get to the Lincoln Memorial, what do you tell?
Hang on. I want to hear that. We're going to take a quick break. You've been listening to You're Hired. I'm your host, Lorne Epstein, here on 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia. We'll be right back. You're listening to You're Hired on 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia. I'm your host, Lorne Epstein. Thanks for listening to our show. If you're interested in getting on the show, you can give me a call at 240-876-0276 or follow us on Facebook at You're Hired. And you can join my meetup where we teach interview skills at interviewskillstogetthejob at meetup.com. Again, I'm your host, Lorne Epstein. You're listening to You're Hired on 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia. Welcome back to the show. You're listening to You're Hired. I'm your host, Lorne Epstein. You're listening to 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia. I'm here talking with Paul Costello on making meaning at work and storytelling. Paul, you were just saying about being a tour guide trainer?
Well, I mean, I one of my friends runs one of the most successful tour guide training program, for years and years and years. Her name is Maruka Donato, and Maruka gets me in every class to take the class she's training around the Lincoln, the Vietnam, Korea Memorial, and I'm like their story coach. But I mean, I'm trying to put out to them to say, don't be boring. And you've got teenage kids from Nebraska or somewhere, you've got 2 hours or 3 hours on that bus to give them a little bit of inspiration. That in fact, that every day, there's maybe 1 million visitors in the season a day, and there's probably, 20 million stories told in Washington every day. That's how the Republic is created and sustained, the stories we tell about it. So I just think there's some quality control issues here around. If the Republic is going down the tube, then I suspect it may be the quality of the stories we're telling about it.
Well, so you've made a interesting proposition. So do you think the Republic is going down the tube?
Well, I think that's a story.
Right.
See,
okay.
and
it's one of the stories.
It's one of the stories. And then if you believe that, or if I sell you that,
because I don't believe that.
No, I mean, but it's just like optimism or pessimism. It's just a question of that we have to take responsibility for that stories create the world.
I'll tell you why I think that. This country has been through a lot, particularly, and I always think this is one of the worst times, was the Civil War.
Absolutely.
Where it wasn't that we just didn't disagree with each other. We actually, in fact, killed one another, and families killed within families. That's not happening now. And we recovered after that. And through everything that's going on, right, we seem to go up and to the right. We seem to get better in a lot of ways. And often my story about America is more of a human story. That human beings have been waking up. That there's a whole bunch of us who have become more aware and more conscious to our surroundings. And as that occurs, there's like an inverse pull, to a more baser, more violent kind of conversation. But there's still a lot of people, and I think the supermajority of Americans are loving, kind, good human beings.
Right.
And they think, and maybe one of the things that may be true is that we think that there is some boogeyman or something out there. Right. And that's where I think is the falsehood. I don't think there's no boogeyman, there's no bad thing out there, because, nothing is really out there. Right? It's just more people.
Well, I think you're right. See,
but again, all those things lead me to believe that factually, life is good.
And I mean, then you believe that and tell that story, and then that creates the world that you want to live in and you want to bring, you want to manifest that. So the story has an impact, I mean, I think if someone's telling you the world is going to hell in a handbasket, the first thing I want you to ask yourself is, why is he telling me that story? What's the intention? And, does he want me to buy his security alarm system? Does he want me to buy more guns? What is he? It's like
buy gold.
Buy gold.
That was the story around buying gold.
So I think
the world's ending. Buy gold.
So I mean, the principle we try and teach our young people in these programs: what you give meaning to is what you give power to. So in other words, it can mean the world can be going great, can be going worse. that's up to you to make some choices around, but it has consequences. And you can't prove it. You can never prove one or the other in a way. There's enough evidence for both. But it just means then you're the poet of your own life. You get to decide what it means.
So I want to unpack the thing you said about helping the tourists tell stories, because I want to get in some nitty gritty here. So give me an example of what you work with the tour guides.
The tour guides.
Tour guides,
a lot of the tour guides who are new to the game sort of, you've paid me $12 and so you're on my tour and I'm going to show you the Washington Monument. So it'll start with, the Washington Monument is 765 feet tall or whatever it is, and it's made of this granite and it's made of this and it's made of that and it's made of that. And it's like reading the Wikipedia first paragraph. And I'm kind of saying to them, like, you've lost them. Then they're not. Unless somebody is really into the statistics of this or an architect, they're not interested. You've got to earn. I tell my kids, everyone's got a right to say what they want to say, but you don't have a right to be heard. You've got to earn the right to be heard. So why should I care? Why should I care how high the Washington Monument is or what it's made of? So the starting point of every tour guide is to say, I've got to earn your attention. I've got to make you care that this story, there's so many mysteries about the Washington Monument. Let me unpack a few of them. Like there's ghosts here, and and you can see it's that tall, but can you see that crack up there? Let me tell you about that crack and the great earthquake of 6 years ago. Wow, you got to build drama, excitement, mystery, surprise, rather than just be a kind of a machine. So that's what I'm trying to say. Let's make the American story, dramatic, interesting, sexy, and so I'm always wanting them to tell some of the funny stories or some of the bizarre stories. The statue on top of the Capitol building was carved was made by slaves. Okay, Lady Freedom is made by slaves. Isn't that interesting? So the ironies, the twists, the unpredictabilities, that's what I love. I want them to tell some of those human stories that revive the Republic's sort of narratives.
So the program you're working with now is Palestinian kids and Israeli kids. Mm-hmm. And what other kids?
So that's called New Story Leadership, and there's a new program that we've spun off this year. It's the first year of it. It's called Ref America. And it's a pilot program this year. We have 6 high school kids who are new immigrants, Syrian refugee immigrants to the United States.
I know a lot of the folks listening to this show are going to want to get a hold of you. And before we leave, you're going to give out your contact information.
Sure.
But I can say without a doubt, Paul does some amazing work. I mean, I think out of most people that I know, you've lived an incredibly meaningful work life.
Well, I mean, it feels, Lorne, it's interesting you say that, because I kind of feel like I never work. I just feel like this is what I do, and I don't even sort of think of it as work. And it's like you, a lot of it you don't do it for money, but it's just like this is how I want to show up in the world, and I'm just so lucky to have the opportunities here and internationally, which means people give me value and I give them value. I mean, I think the exchange is mutually enriching and encouraging to me to keep on, what's the next adventure? I do think the story work that I do in Israel, internationally, I'm aware in America, there's so many needs here. And I think there's going to be a bit of a shift in the next year or two in some of the focus on my work to say, I think there's a lot of work need to be done in our local communities around what kind of stories we're telling about the Muslim community. What kind of stories are we telling about immigrants? What kind of stories are Democrats telling about Republicans? Or what stories are we telling about people who voted for President Trump? I mean, the story system continues to create a lot of the problems, I think, that we're trying to solve, but we will never solve them unless we take a step back and say, hang on a second, what's the story we're telling here?
Right. Get out of the story washing machine.
Yeah.
And just kind of look at them and
what's
the teller's intention and what's our intention? My intention as a listener.
I mean, and something can be, the same event can be told in 4 different ways. I can tell you a story to make you angry, or I can tell the same story to make you laugh or to make you cry. I think to put intentionality back into the way we tell our story, rather than we just blurb it out and we think, well, that's just a story. Well, no, it's not. You're the teller, you have a choice what you're going to tell and what you're not going to.
I think with a lot of stories, particularly political ones and corporate ones, sometimes when there's an untoward intention or a self-aggrandizement intention, that they use these techniques of storytelling to, like you said earlier, hook people into the story. And I don't know if we're going to get those folks kind of telling more authentic stories or being honest about their stories or turning their cards over about their stories. But you and I, the vast majority of folks who are listening, can do this.
Right.
We can stop the story drama,
and
start making sense of actually what's going on by asking those questions you said earlier. It's like, well, what's the intention of the teller? What does it mean? Right. What are they trying to get me to feel?
Right.
What are they trying to get me to think? And why?
Right. And whose interest is it serving?
Right. And whose interest is it serving?
So, I mean, I think...
So I could say in this story right now, what the people are listening to, I hope they get that my intention is to have them get what it is, the wisdom that you have around stories, so that they walk away from the show a little wiser.
Right. And and I would hope that...
And for that, I want you to send $9.95.
And we'll send an extra set of steak knives.
Only... Like, I'll send them my steak knives. I got like 8 steak knives. Every one of you will get in a steak knife.
I've got 4 and one's broken.
No, those of you who don't send $9.95, you're getting the broken steak knife.
But I just think, meaning, we make meaning. We're meaning-making creatures.
Yeah.
And I think, to take some responsibility about... There's some things we can't change in our lives, but we do have agency around what it means for us. And it could be a disaster, it could be an opportunity, it could be a problem, could be a possibility. How we label it, how we story it has huge consequences in our choices. And I guess that's what I would love people to just to be part of the adventure, because it's not as if I can tell you that how it's done, but I'm always caught up myself in the same stories. Sometimes people who are too good at storytelling seduce themselves into their own fictions.
It's like a drug.
Well, it absolutely is.
And with that, Paul, we're going to wrap up the show.
It's wonderful.
But I want to let people know, how can they reach you if they want to get involved in any of these cool things you're doing?
Well, I mean, there's newsstoryleadership.org is our Israel-Palestine website if people are interested in checking out.
So that's newstoryleadership.org.
Yeah. And then if they want to contact me around the whole story stuff, more generally about any of this stuff, my email is paul@storywise.com. And that's STORYWISE.com. paul@storywise.com.
Paul, thank you so much for sharing an hour of your time and your wisdom.
Thank you, Lorne. It's been great fun.
You've been listening to You're Hired. I'm your host, Lorne Epstein, here on 96.7 FM. We will see you next week here on You're Hired.